We will strengthen and equalise the law so that LGBT and hate crimes attract tougher sentences. We will ban all forms of conversion therapy outright, including trans conversion therapy. And we will modernise the outdated Gender Recognition Act. We have always been the party of equality. We stand up for LGBT rights, not because it's always easy, but because it's the right thing to do.
Thank you all for coming to this evening's special edition of Levelling Up the Conversation to mark 50 years of Pride in the UK. Whether you're watching from home or joining us live here in the studio, we thank you all for coming today. We are set for a fantastic discussion looking at the progress of LGBTQ+ rights over the last 50 years, as well as how much further we have to go. My name is Chandni Sembhi. I'm a senior producer at PinkNews, and I will be chairing this evening's discussion. First up, we have Minister Mike Freer and Baroness Thornton with their opening statements.
Thanks very much. Those of you who don't know me, I'm Mike Freer. I'm the Minister for Equalities with specific responsibility for LGBT+ issues in government, and I'd like to thank the Chamber for asking me to speak to you today, and particularly to celebrate Pride and the 50th anniversary of the first official Pride in the UK this July, because the anniversary represents a unique opportunity to reflect on the past 50 years and on the changes that we've seen in the country, and to acknowledge the time and energy that so many people have put in place to advance the rights and protections of LGBT people at home and abroad. Many of those protections that we sometimes take for granted, although I just come back from the States when the Roe against Wade decision came out, leading an LGBT trade delegation. And so that was a very stark reminder that whilst we have made progress, that we do need to be on our guard to ensure that those who would wish to roll back our rights, we are ever vigilant so that we can defeat any attempts to take our rights away. And of course, we have made progress since that first official march, and I'm proud of the strides that we've made in advancing our rights since then. And particularly, just wanted to make special tribute to all of those people who made it possible for those of us who are active in public life, or out at work, or just out with our family, living quietly, whatever way the LGBT+ community chooses to live their lives. I think that we need to respect and pay tribute to those who have worked tirelessly in the previous years to make it happen. And of course, in 1967, when the law was finally changed to allow two men to be in a relationship together without fear of being arrested, it wasn't until about 2000, 2003 that we started to see real change on things like equalising the age of consent, that we started to see true parity. And of course, in 2004, the Civil Partnership Act was passed, giving same-sex couples the same rights and responsibilities as married straight couples across the UK. And that was followed in 2013 by the Marriage Same-Sex Couples Act, a bill that I was hugely proud to stand up and advocate for in Parliament. And then with the first same-sex marriages in England and Wales taking place in 2014, I have to say those marriages in 2014 was a moment close to my heart, and I have to say close to my husband's heart as well, because we are now able to call ourselves husbands rather than civil partners. And I always apologise to my officials because they always write notes for me and I always totally go off script. But I do genuinely love being able to talk about Angelo as my husband, because I just remembered, I know sometimes it's the little things that just remind us of the progress. And I always resented having to declare civil partnered rather than married. And it doesn't, the difference was perhaps minuscule, but having to declare on a form or to officialdom my sexuality without being given a choice was one of the things that really irritated. And so now when I tick married, it's my decision whether I say that it is a same-sex marriage or not. And that, I know it sounds like a small thing, but that ability to just say I am married, I have to say, is very meaningful. And I do thoroughly enjoy, as also the Exports Minister, going abroad perhaps into some countries who are, shall we say, further behind on the journey on equality, and talking about my husband, and then just moving on, and then just letting the penny drop, and then wait to see if we get any reaction. Interestingly enough, even in areas of the world where equalities are, shall we say, significantly behind where we are, being able to talk about my husband so far has yet to elicit a negative response. And sometimes I see my role as a government minister to be able to talk about my husband is a way of just simply normalising the issue, being visible, being in front of us a opposite number in a government that is not supportive on equal rights, to be able to show them that the gay married man in front of them isn't someone with horns and a tail, that actually we are exactly like everybody else, we just go home and love somebody else. That, I think, is a very, very powerful message that, we start to, if you like, demonize, if you can demonize the whole thing about equalities. And so I do want to just cover off just some of the progress, because I think sometimes we focus on all the work we need to do, which is perfectly understandable, because we have got things that we need to address. But let's not lose sight of the fact that we have made significant changes. We have looked at disregards of convictions and pardons. We've launched the Veteran Strategy Action Plan, which is an independent review to assess the impact of the historic ban on LGBT personnel in the military and the impact it had on those veterans. I'm particularly pleased to see that Lord Etherton has agreed to chair the review, bringing his extensive legal skills and knowledge, but also his own personal experience as the first openly gay judge on the senior courts in the UK, that experience to bear on that review of our veterans. We did see the repeal of Section 28 in England and Wales. And again, when I was just come back from Texas, being able to speak to the LGBT community in Texas and say that their governor and the governor of Florida is talking absolute nonsense. So when they say, don't say gay, I can say, learn from my party that got it spectacularly wrong, 30 odd years ago. We've been down this route. We know that if you try and say, don't say gay, it does not work. And so in terms of being able to say that overseas is a very powerful message that we have got things wrong and we've tried to put them right. But equally, having that experience, having lived through that experience, is also very personal, but also very powerful in being able to, if you like, give encouragement to our colleagues overseas who are still having to fight certain battles. But also in terms of dealing with the aftermath of Section 28, continuing to fund to the tune of over £4 billion to combat homophobic bullying in schools. That's not just homophobic bullying, but biphobic and transphobic bullying. We have reformed the Gender Recognition Act in terms of making it easier, digitising it, reducing the cost. I know there's disappointment that the government didn't go further on the reform of the GRA, but in terms of the Equalities Act, major strides forward to protecting the provision of goods, facilities, services, education, and public functions on the grounds of sexual orientation or what is deemed in the Act gender reassignment. But also in terms of making sure that LGBT people have access to healthcare. A major review, two issues being dealt with quite firmly. One, Dr. Brady is looking at the whole healthcare system, particularly focusing on trans, and Professor Kevin Fenton looking at the HIV strategy, looking that we can eradicate HIV infections completely within the next 5 years. But also addressing those issues that facing the trans community. I visited Clinic Q to see for myself some of the firsthand for myself some of the challenges being faced by the trans community because our trans healthcare system in the UK is simply not good enough. People having to opt out, buy things on the internet, we don't know what they're buying, whether they're getting the right dosage. So I had a conversation with Sajid Javid, and he is firmly committed to working with the Equalities team to overhaul the trans healthcare system. And in terms of some of the other successes, having both PEP and PrEP available, fully funded now in sexual health budgets across the UK. blood donations now been relaxed so that gay men can give blood. But I just wanted to, if you like, touch on, if I may, some of the challenges that we face. And I want to be quite upfront that whilst we will continue to champion LGBT rights globally, clearly we were disappointed to have to cancel the Safe to Be Me conference, but that doesn't mean that we have walked away from our commitment to help fund NGOs overseas, particularly to make legal challenges in those jurisdictions which continue to criminalise homosexuality. And so we continue to do that work globally whilst we address some of the issues outstanding remaining in the UK. And in terms of that, I do want to know that people to know that the Conversion Practices Bill, I know we call it Conversion Therapy Bill. There's been quite a lot of debate about changing that from therapy to practices, because conversion therapy makes it sound warm and cuddly, that in some way it's supportive. Well, it's not. And so that's why we are now defaulting to the ban of conversion practices. And it's no secret that I wanted the bill to be entirely inclusive. However, where we are is the bill is being drafted to include LGB, whilst a separate piece of work is being undertaken to address some of the issues which are challenging and challenging some people's understanding of what we need to do to ensure that the trans community are also protected. And I hope that that piece of work will progress speedily whilst we get the bill through Parliament, so that it is my hope and remains my hope that the bill completes its package fully inclusive. And that's kind of, we've covered off where some of the real improvements that we've made in this country. And I don't think we should lose sight of the fact that we have made significant advances, whilst accepting we still have many challenges going forward. And one of them where I am redoubling my efforts is to ensure that the trans community are fully supported to the best of my ability, and challenging my colleagues across government to ensure not just that they do the right thing, but also that they say the right thing, because I don't think people realise that sometimes words can be more hurtful than they anticipate. And so I just wanted to finally say that I am proud that we have worked with so many civil society organisations, including Stonewall. Stonewall is a partner, contrary to what the media would have you believe. Nancy and I get on extremely well. We have robust conversations. I think it's true to say that our relationship between the government and Stonewall is mature enough that we can have our disagreements, we can have what the diplomats call frank discussions, whilst we continue to get on and work together. And pay tribute to the work that Stonewall did in the settlement of Afghan refugees and Rainbow Railroad. A massive, behind-the-scenes, very quiet piece of work to be done, was successful, and Stonewall were integral in helping deliver that. And so I just wanted to really pay tribute to the people that are involved in civil society for the nitty-gritty, real grinding work that has to be done on a daily basis. And I'm proud to be the UK's Equality Minister for LGBT+, because I recognise the progress we've made, but equally I'm not blind to the problems we face. And I hope that in the next, particularly in the next year, as we pursue the ban of the conversion therapy or conversion practice, just fell into my own trap, of getting it through Parliament, that I can count on the support of all of the civil society, even if we don't agree on everything. Where we do agree is let's work together to ensure that things like the conversion practices are banned once and for all. So thank you for the support of the civil society. Thank you for the work you've done. And I hope that if you need to reach out to me, get hold of me at the Equalities office. And my door is always open if you have any ideas of what we need to do differently. But please, let's work together to ensure that the day-to-day lives of the LGBT+ community are improved as we go forward.
I'd like to thank the Chamber for inviting me. Am I close enough to the microphone? Do I need to wave my arms about or anything? I'd like to thank the Chamber for inviting me to speak in place of Annalise Dodds, who's, of course, my boss, and Shadow Secretary of State for Women and Equalities. Unfortunately, she's recovering from a bout of COVID. But I'm very delighted to be here to contribute to what I think will be an interesting and important discussion. And of course, there is indeed a great deal to celebrate in this 50th year since the first Pride March took place in July 1972, which was actually the year before I came to the LSE to London, because I'm quite old. And indeed, that year, 1973 and 74, I was very active in the London School of Economics and in the women's group, and we were very active in supporting the gay pride activity that followed from the 1972. So half a century later, so yes, that puts me to about 70 years old, life has changed the better for LGBT plus people in so many ways, and we should be very proud of that, as the Minister has said. And I'd like to congratulate him for his speech and for the tone of his speech, which I think is absolutely appropriate for the celebration that we're having and that we're seeing this week and this year. It could be easy to look back and say, well, you know, that progress was inevitable, but actually it wasn't inevitable. I was chair of the Labour Party in London in 1985 during a period of extreme hostility towards LGBT plus people. And that was the year where the Labour Party voted a resolution committing our party to lesbian and gay rights. And of course, just 2 years later, the campaign against our position on LGBT rights was used in the general election by our opponents in the Conservative Party. And then followed Margaret Thatcher's homophobic Section 28, which banned councils and schools from the promotion of homosexuality as a pretended family relationship. I'm very pleased to hear the Minister say that was a mistake and that the Conservative Party is not in that place today. And I hope that indeed is the case. And of course, it was the Labour government in 2003 which removed that from the statute book. It was the Labour government who's done more to advance LGBT plus rights and equality than any other government in the UK's history. And I am very proud of that. I went into the House of Lords in 1998, and I have been party to either campaigning for, active in, or a minister of equality, women and equal rights throughout the whole of those 25 years. We introduced the Unmarried Partners Concession, which committed the UK to ending discrimination against gay and lesbian couples for immigration purposes. We lifted the ban on lesbians, gay men and bi people serving in the armed forces. We introduced civil partnerships in the face, I have to say, of very strong opposition from the Conservatives at the time. We introduced laws that allowed unmarried couples, including same-sex couples, to apply for joint adoption. I was actually the Women and Equalities Minister who put that legislation on the statute book, and it was a huge battle that we had in the House of Lords to get that through. Very important indeed. So today we know that the hostility is much less overt than it was in the 1980s. But I think we'll have to say to the Minister and to the government that it is really disappointing that Save to Be Me Global Equality Conference isn't taking place in this country. It should have been today, I think. And the reason it's not taking place is because of the position that some of the Conservative government have taken over these issues. And it's not happening because, and led to the resignation, for example, of their own LGBT advisor. And the resignation of Ian Anderson and the withdrawal of over 100 LGBT organisations and charities from Save to Be Me last April was a direct consequence of the government's decision to reverse its plans to ban trans conversion therapy. Now, I mean, I hope that when we come to deal with this issue and we get to the House of Lords will, of course, as it often does in these matters, take a much more progressive view than the Conservative government. I think my understanding of what the Minister has been saying to us is that he will have our full support if he's serious about being inclusive in the conversion therapy practices. Then he will have the full support across the House of Lords in that matter. So I hope we might be able to work on that together, because that's actually how we have made progress on these issues. And that's why I would like to pay a huge compliment, for example, to Stonewall for the fact that they have worked consistently with every government that they've had to deal with, positively, sometimes very quietly, and continue to do so. And it's been, when I was the Opposition Women and Equalities Minister in the House of Lords, that's when the coalition government put through the Equal Marriage Bill, from which the Minister has benefited quite rightly. And that was, I think, really was a wonderful moment when we got that legislation on the statute book. And it was done through in fact, I have a picture of myself and the then leader of the House of Lords, who was a woman, outside the House of Lords holding a poster saying, "Women marry women, get over it." And it was really it's not often, I have to tell you, as a legislator, that you pass legislation that really truly makes people happy. And that piece of legislation made people happy and was definitely worthwhile. I do think that the Conservative government has actually been moving backwards on LGBT equality in this 50th year, and I think that's a matter of great sadness. And I think that I need to say that a Labour government, and we might be looking at a Labour government in the next year or so, will do the opposite. We will continue to protect and uphold the Equality Act, including the protections for LGBT plus people. We will require employers to create and maintain workplaces free from LGBT plus harassment, including third parties. We will strengthen and equalise the law so that LGBT and hate crimes attract tougher sentences. We will ban all forms of conversion therapy outright, including trans conversion therapy. And we will modernise the outdated Gender Recognition Act. We have always been the party of equality. We stand up for LGBT rights, not because it's always easy, but because it's the right thing to do. So for me, this week is more about celebrating the wonderful diversity of our country, the achievements of the last 50 years, as important as that is, but it's also about my party, recommitting itself to doing the things that we can to ensure that every person in the UK is treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their sexual orientation or their gender identity. The 50 years of Pride have shown that we have become a much more tolerant country with a proud record of progress on equality. So whilst we've made great progress, I think we do have some way to go to achieve LGBT plus equality in truth. Thank you.
Thank you both for your really thoughtful reflections on how far we've come, but also the work that there is still yet to do. And before we get started, just in light of the tragedy at Oslo Pride that took place on Saturday, we would like to hold a 2-minute silence. Thank you, everyone. And for those wishing to pay respects, there is a vigil happening at Soho Square after today's event. But for today, we are set for a fantastic discussion, and we're joined by a really great panel. So we have Stewart, founder and CEO of Gendered Intelligence. We have Peter Gibson, MP for Darlington and Vice Chair of the APPG for Global LGBT+ Rights. We have Nancy Kelley, Chief Executive of Stonewall, and of course Baroness Thornton, Shadow Spokesperson for Women and Equalities in the Lords. We had a series of pre-submitted questions from the audience, which we will be discussing today. We had loads of great questions, so I apologise if we weren't able to get to yours. If you're in the studio or at home and you want to tweet along with today's event, be sure to use the hashtag #LUTC. That's hashtag #LUTC. So without further ado, let's jump into the questions. So I wanted to know from each of you, what's been the most inspiring LGBT+ related development seen in the UK over the last 50 years? And also, what are you looking forward to in the future? So I don't know if it's easier to start with Joe, if we can just move in this direction.
Get the first one. Really good, positive question. I think it's really important to remember and remind ourselves of the areas of LGBTQ+ life, which is joyful and positive and inspiring. For people who don't know Genders Intelligence, we work a lot within the trans community. We're a trans-led charity working across the UK. We do a little bit of work around public policy alongside colleagues like Nancy. But we do spend most of our time in the community, on the ground, working with people. And I just think what inspires me is seeing all these brilliant trans people in all their diversity sort of come forward and kind of be themselves and do themselves in the way that is kind of right for them. And for me, what's been happening in my time within the trans community is an increase in connectivity and a desire to come together, to feel a sense of belonging across our communities. So for me, that's kind of what I would want to flag up, and we need more of that. And I think there is a bit of a mismatch around the groundswell of positivity and trans joy that's happening in my world, and kind of what people see in the mainstream or across public sector. There's just a huge void of trans talent that's just not quite reaching that parapet of visibility, and I think that's what I'm looking forward to in the next 50 years.
That's lovely to hear. And Peter, yourself?
So for me, I think there's two things I want to say in response to this. First of all, for myself, and very much like Mike, it's 14 years since I celebrated my civil partnership with my partner. We've been together for a very long time. We are a cliche. We met at the Young Conservatives, and it's not quite what our parents envisaged for us, but hey ho. So no, we're celebrating 14 years together this August when we celebrated our civil partnership. So that's a real milestone for me. And I was telling somebody the other day that as a demonstration about how far we've come. When I was in my early 20s, my mum said to me, what do you want for your 25th birthday present? And bearing in mind it's 25's a silver significance. And at the time, the prospect of gay marriage, civil partnerships wasn't on the agenda. And I said, Mum, I want a canteen of cutlery, because there was never ever going to be another opportunity in the form of a wedding for somebody to buy me a canteen of cutlery. So I got a canteen of cutlery. But I think on a bigger scale, I think the biggest single example of how far we've come is the number of people involved in public life who are comfortable to be gay. So I've been a member of the Conservative Party for over 30 years, and I remember a time when it was not a comfortable place to be as a gay man. I remember a time when nobody would be selected as a candidate, nobody would be elected as a candidate, and that picture has changed dramatically. We now have significant numbers of gay MPs, gay lords, and that's the same for the other political parties as well. And I think every single one of us, whatever our political standpoint on other issues is that we are there showing people that they can grow up and that they can be open about their sexuality or gender and get on in public life and be an example to the rest of society. And I think that's a really, really strong, important message.
Yeah, I agree. Representation is so important, especially with people claiming that they work for really diverse organisations, but then you look and that's not always the case. Nancy, what about you?
we show my age a bit now. So I guess one of the things that's very powerful for me was the equalisation of the age of consent. I've got a really vivid memory of that. I actually volunteered for Stonewall at the party for equalisation of the age of consent, shaking a tin. And I guess the reason it felt so powerful to me then and now is it was kind of saying, it felt like the beginning of drawing a line under the idea that queer sexuality was disgusting, was dangerous, was different. It was, it was just saying that our sexuality is our sexuality. And that felt really important because so much of homophobia and biphobia, other forms of queerphobia is about othering our desires and our loves. So that is really, really powerful for me. And because Jay always makes me really happy. He's my friend. He always makes me really happy when I talk to him. I'm super uplifted by the change that we see in children and young people. I mean, we shouldn't sugarcoat it. You're still twice as likely to be bullied if you're LGBTQ plus kid these days. But also the way in which my children and their friends are able to talk about sexual orientation, to talk about different kinds of families, to talk about trans people, their trans friends, their gender identity in a really uncomplicated way. I'm blown. When I think about what it was like being at primary school or middle school myself, that blows me away and makes me feel so incredibly hopeful about where we're going to be in another 50 years.
Same, really. I mean, it's amazing when you chat to these young people who are LGBTQ+, and they're just, so many of them are not afraid to be themselves, which is just not something that happened until recently. And finally, Baroness Thompson, what were your thoughts? Thornton, sorry.
Think of chocolates. I absolutely agree. And I thought on my list, the two things that I really felt made a big, sort of leap were the equalisation of the age of consent, and also the fact that LGBT plus parents could adopt. And that was, I can't tell you how that felt in Parliament. It was such a hard-fought issue, right up to the absolute wire there, with particularly Catholic adoption organisations, some of which we just had to close down in the end, because they simply wouldn't accept the legal position and the equality. And that you can imagine the campaign that they did. So I feel kind of proud to have been part of that and to have helped put those things on the statute book. But the other thing is that my children, who are now in their 30s, have such a wide range of friends. They are so comfortable with this world of LGBT+, that it really fills me with enormous pride for them and and fills me with hope for what's going to happen next, which is why I think we will overcome the issues to do with trans. And I am so pleased that the Conservative Party has caught up in the way that it has. I think that is enormously important, and I think the bravery of and courage of some of my parliamentary colleagues needs to be marked, because it has not been easy for them. It wasn't easy, for Chris Smith in the day, and it has not been easy for them. And I think we need to. It's very important that we recognise that. And just finally, I also was involved as a backbench member of the House of Lords in putting the Gender Recognition Act on the statute book. And of course, there's an enormous amount of fear, I think, is one of the things. People were very fearful of what it was exactly that we were doing. And one of the things that we did, I remember very well, because I was very actively involved in the campaign, was that a lot of trans people came into Parliament and told their stories to members of Parliament, to members of the House of Lords. And it did change the passage of that bill. And I just say that and put that out there because actually I think we might need to be doing some more of that.
And it's been really lovely hearing from everyone that, you know, change is coming and that there are plans to actually just make life easier for LGBTQ plus people living in the UK. But with the rights and protections of trans and non-binary people kind of being used as political talking points sometimes, it often seems like, you know, people will make promises that aren't always fulfilled. So how can we meaningfully work to support the trans and non-binary community and enshrine their freedom from oppression in law? I don't know who wanted to take this first.
I think it's a really important and timely question. I think this is definitely where we're up to in terms of the current climate, talking about trans and non-binary people and identities. But I think just listening to some of the stories that people have accomplished in the last 50 years, it is this thing about fear. So what is it that just troubles people so much to be so afraid of trans life? And I think the answer is around education and taking the kind of depolarization within the kind of quote-unquote debate out of the mix, really. So leaning into the nuance, leaning into the richness of the conversation, trying to dig deep in terms of what are people's concerns and how can we support them to air those in a safe way? How can we address worries that people genuinely have? The fear of otherness, ultimately, I think it still pervades our society. We're still here talking about the same thing of, you know, why we're so troubled by this, the presence that we don't understand and we can't get our head around. So I think trans is just the current conversation to a very old story, really. And let's just take the opportunity to support people around, engaging in discussion. And I think you're right. I think young people are starting to have these discussions, and challenges are happening at a peer kind of level within our young population. We know that our young people, our young trans people that we work with, are coming out and telling people, and so there's something that means that they feel safe enough to do that or ready enough to do that, and so something is right. But there is a lot of work to do still to continue to educate peers. I mean, I've got children of my own as well. They're 13 now, and so whilst we can paint in part a rosy picture around young people's lives, and young people seem to be a bit more tolerant and accepting, I think there's still not enough education happening from my perspective, and there's not enough formal spaces for people to talk about this in a safe way. So TikTok is happening and all of that stuff, but where are the actual lessons where people feel they're having some, kind of just doing some myth busting, because these things are still circulating around people's heads and they're not necessarily sure. I think from my children tell me that they call it the F slur, meaning the kind of, the derogatory word for gay men is abundant in their school system. Everyone is saying it all the time. And the T slur, they call it as well. It's kind of, a daily utterance. So we can't paint a completely rosy picture here. But they did also tell me that there was a diversity day at school the other day, and everyone went to the LGBT stall. Everybody went. And there's a lot of people coming out as bisexual as well. And so it's both and, I think, and we just need to kind of really not paint this kind of either or polarized picture, but it's a complex discourse that we should be leaning into and digging deep around and challenging, critically but kindly, where people are up to with their thinking.
Yeah, of course. And I think education is such an important topic, because I know when I had sex and relationship education 10 years ago, it was very heteronormative. There was nothing about diverse genders or sexuality. So for the rest of the panel, I was wondering about your thoughts on the education system and schooling and what progress you think needs to be made there.
I was just laughing because when I went to school, I just got a talk from what was called then the tampon lady. Let me tell you, it did not prepare me for a life as a sexually active teenager.
You should have tried it 20 years earlier than that.
I don't want to think about it.
I think think it was frogs, but I wouldn't say.
Yeah, no, I'll try not to divert this very grown-up conversation by my flashbacks to my own experience of sexual relationships education. I think for me, there's a couple of things. So we've come, just such a long distance in terms of, repealing Section 28, having statutory inclusive sex and relationships education on the books now, everywhere apart from Northern Ireland, although working on it. But there's a lot to do to equip teachers to deliver that well. These are complicated conversations. These are conversations that you're sometimes having with children that come from families that hold all sorts of views about sexual orientation and gender identity, have all sorts of different knowledge levels. And I think there's a lot more that needs to be done so that teachers in our schools feel really confident talking about just the diversity of human relationships, the diversity of human identity, and creating those safe spaces that Jay's talking about for all children. Because I think it's not just about LGBTQ plus children in schools being safe, although that's hugely important. Schools in which LGBTQ plus children aren't safe are schools in which children aren't safe. I have no idea what my children are little and adopted, thank you. I've no idea what their sexual orientation is. They don't really know yet. It kind of changes from week to week. But they've been bullied for having lesbian mums, and that's normal, right? I'm sure your kids have had fun times because of who you are, right? So we think that there is a really important piece of work about investing in schools and investing in teachers and senior leadership teams so that they can create that inclusive environment and so they can deliver relationships and sex education well and with confidence.
Of course, and speaking of inclusion, it's not a secret. Trans people are often excluded from a whole range of spaces, unfortunately, and with the comments this morning around new guidelines in sport, a trans woman will only be eligible to compete in certain sports if they have not experienced male puberty before the age of 12. So I was wondering how the dialogue will be changed for transgender people to prevent them from being further marginalised, not just in sports, but in society in general.
Can I just respond to the previous question and follow up on what Jay said? And I think it takes in some of the points that Baroness Thornton made. I've talked about the trans issue to lots of my colleagues who perhaps have different views to me. And it strikes me that there's a great deal of prejudice there, and that prejudice comes from a lack of understanding, lack of knowledge, lack of exposure. These are people who've perhaps not met a trans person, not experienced their story. And I think that the suggestion you have about bringing more trans people in to have those sensible, serious conversations with parliamentarians is a really positive way to improve that dialogue and understanding.
And do you think by transgender people doing that, that can kind of help there be a larger understanding and therefore kind of stop marginalisation? Is that the solution?
I don't think the debate that we're having about trans people now is any different from the debate that we were having about gay and lesbian people 30 years ago. The language that we hear is identical to the language that we were hearing 30 years ago.
Its toxicity is partly because of the mediums through which it's being conducted. And I think our responsibility as parliamentarians, I'm sure you would agree, is to get away from that toxicity.
I agree.
Oh, sorry, were you about to say something?
Well, I was reflecting on the question that you were posing because I think it's actually a really very important question. And I don't have an answer for it. However, it's a process, isn't it? And I think that sports organisations will need to reflect very carefully on the way that they conduct themselves in this space. And they will need to look at they will need to be considerate about it. They will need to be kind. I mean, part of all of this is about actually being respectful of people and working out what's the best way forward. And I don't have an answer for that one because I don't really know I don't know what the answer is. I don't know if you've got an answer, if you've worked out what that answer is.
We've had an answer. I'll have a go at the question, though.
Yeah,
I'll
have a go. Well, I mean, it is one of those knotty questions. And the thing is, what happens with these is that they get polarised and toxic, and then they get thrown at those of us who actually want to take the whole agenda forward.
Yeah. So, I mean, the first thing that I would say, I think you're talking about the swimming guidance, right? So the first thing I would say about the FINA guidance for international athletes is actually quite important for us to remember that it's not actually just about trans athletes. It's incredibly restrictive of intersex athletes also. And it really worries me that we're not talking about both of those things. So what it does is it creates a de facto total ban on trans girls and women competing in swimming and diving at the elite level, because the number of trans girls that have completed a transition at 12 and then can maintain testosterone testing, all the way through, and are also elite level swimmers, bearing in mind how few trans people there are, that means it's a ban on trans girls and women competing at the elite level. And in relation to intersex women, which we aren't acknowledging enough, the proposal is to require mandatory chromosome testing of all women and girls competing at the elite level, which is extraordinary. It means people will find out they are intersex because they are forced to be tested by their sporting body. And if they have certain specific intersex conditions, will be, again, banned from competing. So elite sport, I don't think community sport is complicated. People should be able to kick a ball around and have a paddle. I acknowledge that elite sport is complicated. But I think what we can say about bans like this is that they are not fair, right? That is a blanket ban on large populations, whether they have or don't have a competitive advantage, participating in a sport that they would have worked for years and years and years to be competitive in. And that can't be right. And I think that the IOC, the Olympic principles on fairness and inclusion, are just much stronger and more sensible place to start. They see sport as a human right, they see inclusion as the starting point, and they say if you are going to exclude, you have to have really good and specific evidence to do that. So I think in relation to elite sports, I would just say, kind of coming back to the first principles, and I think the IOC principles are really good, is really important. And I think it just does have to be named that in a lot of these sports where you see these very rapid changes, it is purely in response, it's a knee-jerk response to media coverage, actually, about individual trans athletes. Like, I can name, and probably everybody in this room can name the reason that the swimming guidelines just changed. And that's wild, that's wrong, because there is one young trans woman who might one day be able to compete at the Olympic level. We're going to ban all trans women and girls and a whole category of intersex women. That's not right.
Of course. And speaking of exclusion, I was wondering what your thoughts are on trans people being excluded from the conversion therapy ban, given that they are some of the most vulnerable members of the LGBTQ+ community. I mean, the government's own research suggests that trans people are much more likely to have undergone or been offered conversion therapy.
I'm on the record. I'm in Hansard during the recent debate on International Women's Day saying this is discriminatory.
I'm on the record in Hansard last week's Westminster Hall debate on exactly that same point. And, I am in favour of a trans-inclusive conversion therapy ban. If people take the time to listen to the minister who's spoken to us this evening, his speech at the end of that Westminster Hall debate, I think there's some really warm words of comfort for us in navigating what is a very difficult topic with challenges from inside government, inside the Conservative Party. But I think in Mike Freer, we've got an excellent champion for making sure that we end up eliminating conversion practices that impact everybody. And I'm committed to working with Mike to making sure that happens.
And so am I, actually. as I said.
Yeah, and it's wonderful to hear that changes are being made, but how are we ensuring that the government truly is advocating for equal rights and actually being able to hold the government to account on these topics?
Shall I go again?
Yeah, go on. You can...
Well, the Conservative Party now in Parliament has more than, I think at the current tally, something north of 30 gay and lesbian members of Parliament. Some of them are in government, some of them are ministers, and they champion those causes. And indeed, we've got some very vocal advocates and allies who are not necessarily part of our community. I think in particular of Alicia Kearns and the work that she's done in respect of that. So there are strong voices on those Conservative benches who are doing that and making sure that that happens. But it isn't always as simple as saying that the government's wrong because it hasn't done this. We know that the creation of laws and legislation is not a nice, lovely, clean process. It's painful and it can be hard work. And we've got to take people with us. But having those allies and champions inside Parliament, I think, is a really strong way. And as I said before, I think getting the trans community to talk to politicians, talk to their MPs, and raise their concerns, I think will help deepen that understanding and remove that prejudice.
And we had a lot of questions come in about healthcare, and it's great to hear that PrEP is more widely available now. But undiagnosed people, living with HIV are twice as likely to be living outside of London, and yet opt-out HIV testing is only happening at 4 A&Es outside of London. So can hospital HIV testing be levelled up, and what are your thoughts?
Can I dive in there?
Yeah, go on. I'm going to say yes, it's disgraceful.
It's shameful. And we need to extend that. I'm doing a piece of work with the Terence Higgins Trust to arrange a meeting for all of those MPs with those high prevalence rates to make sure that we can extend that and lobby government to make sure that that opt-out testing is extended to those areas where there is a higher prevalence of that. So it's absolutely something that I'm committed to working on.
I've just stopped being the Shadow Health Minister in the House of Lords, and I think I have averaged 2 questions a year on this issue, pushing the government on it because it's so important and it's so unfair.
I wonder if I could just build maybe on healthcare, because I think that it's one of the areas that LGBTQ plus people's needs are really underserved. So this is one really important example, and of course I think that opt-out testing should be everywhere, right? So I won't even answer that. But we can think of areas like, mental health, right? So LGBTQ plus people have twice the rate of kind of diagnosable mental health problems as straight and cis people do, and throughout their lifetime. Our children from our community are much more likely to experience mental distress. Our elders are much more likely to experience mental distress. There is just a real absence of investment, of understanding, of thoughtfulness of services that provide for that need. You can think of access to fertility services, deeply unequal within our community. We're campaigning along with BPAS for IVF for all, for instance. And then I think it's so important, and when we talk about healthcare, we shouldn't see gender-affirming healthcare as somewhere off in the distance and a separate issue. It is a form of healthcare that is required by our community, and it is beyond disgraceful that so many trans people will wait years and years, to access healthcare. So I think there are lots of areas with healthcare where we just haven't focused enough on the particular needs of LGBTQ plus people. And I think it's really important to look at that as a whole and think about what does an inclusive healthcare strategy look like.
Of course, because again, with the community being so diverse, there aren't just 3 issues. There are a whole range of things affecting our community. For example, elder LGBTQ plus people, are their needs being met through health and social care agendas going forward? Because a government survey showed that older LGBT plus people have worse experiences of accessing healthcare, and even higher prevalence of mental health issues, especially with transgender elderly people. So did the panel have any thoughts on specifically health and social policies for elder LGBTQ plus people?
I just want to make 2 points in respect to that. Obviously, coming here this afternoon, the mental health bill was having its second reading in the chamber, and I look forward to receiving Nancy's briefing document once it's been digested. I think the issues around how we care for and deal with an ageing lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans community is one that's going to emerge over coming years. If you think about it, we're at a stage where people who are openly gay have, they've finished their careers, they're retired, they're downsizing. So many of those issues we wouldn't have considered numbers of years ago because they were closeted, they weren't visible. And so now that they are out and in the open, I think we need to be sensitive to their needs and again, have some conversations around that. I think one of the most worrying thoughts for people in our community would be that they have to go back into the closet.
And lots of people do.
And I think that's really, really sad. Really sad.
And one of the issues there is that because so many care homes are run by the private sector, and this is not a question, this is not an issue of privatisation or anything I'm making, but it's about the guidance and the rules and the practices of those places that may be untouched by the values and the practices that we want to see happen. And that seems to me to be a challenge for health and social care, is to make sure that in places that get LGBTQ people retired to actually are appropriate and they don't have to go back into the closet.
And just to chip in on that, because from a trans perspective, sometimes our bodies give us away. And I think when you're in a situation where people are caring for you and bathing you and all the rest of it, it's not a case, or there may not be a choice around going back into the closet because that's kind of there, whether you like it or not. So I think it's, what is inclusive practice in these sectors? How can we support professionals to work with dignity and respect, everybody, including trans people? I think are kind of key, very, very key questions. And there's also an interesting conversation that's happening in the sector, which is where do you educate the mainstream so that everyone can access these services, including LGBTQ people, and where do we provide tailored services for older LGBTQ plus people where they will be happy and safe and in a community, where they will be respected and understood. So I think we need that both and approach again.
Yeah, just to kind of build as well, I think it's important to remember we quite often talk about kind of LGBTQ plus people are no different than cis and straight people, and of course we are quite different in some ways, right? And one of the ways in which we're different is we're much less likely to have children, like loads less likely to have children, and we're much more likely, particularly in our older generations, to be estranged from family. And so if you think about that from the perspective of aging, and you go through a process, whether you're trans or lesbian or whatever, you go through a process of retiring from work, where you have all of these social connections and you meet people and etc. And you don't have kids. Maybe you're one of the many people in our community that don't have kids, and you aren't in touch with your brothers or your sisters anymore. And so I think thinking about how we also, not only about care, but how we create joy and connection and the ability to form loving, nurturing friendships and relationships for our elders is also a really important issue.
Can I just make a point on top of that? In my former career as a high street solicitor advising, elderly people on preparation of powers of attorney and drafting wills, having given advice to lesbian and gay people who were getting older, their range of options as to who they can get to act as their executors, to act as their attorneys is really small, because they haven't got those children. They might be relying on, distant niece that they haven't seen for many years. And so it's really important that something is done to build up those networks to provide that support for them.
And just to chip in on that as well, I think where I'm up to with the professionalisation, for want of a better word, within the trans voluntary sector and the LGBTQ plus voluntary sector, is adding value to the health and social care services, so that we can do some of this work, that we can be, in the community, from the community, for the community, and our hearts are kind of in the right place in terms of making this community belonging and reducing social isolation kind of happen. And it's not difficult, it's just a resourcing issue. We can build this work and really impact positively on our health, our mental health, our physical health, our ageing population. I think this is the way that we need to be thinking, working in partnership with the voluntary sector.
Of course, and so obviously an ageing LGBTQ plus population is a big concern going forward, but I was wondering what each of you see as the biggest issue for the LGBTQ plus community in the next 5 years?
Well, I think there's still quite a lot of discrimination at work. Yeah. I really do. And I think we have to be much stronger about how we deal with that, what the law says about that. And the fact that I would like the EHRC to be, how can I put this, more active on it, and more there on these issues. There's a sort of there's an attitude that we've got all these things on the statute book and so on, and therefore it's all right, and that is simply not the case. So it is partly education, it is partly championship, it's certainly some of our trade unions who've been doing a good job on this, but we really, that for me, I think that's very important.
I think health really is the big ticket item from my perspective in that big sense, but also within the GIC, the gender affirming healthcare services as well. It's woeful at the moment. People are just looking to, there's more trans people coming out wanting to access medical intervention or at least explore options, and the kind of the waiting list is just beyond, depressing, quite frankly. And the impact, we don't even know what the impact is yet in terms of our mental health. It's super serious, and that's absolutely where the priority needs to be for the next 5 years.
I don't think you can narrow it down to one single thing. We've talked about a number of issues, not least the conversion practices. That there's more work to be done in this country, but I think we do a disservice to our gay brothers and sisters, our lesbian brothers and sisters, our trans brothers and sisters around the world if we don't continue to champion and fight for their right to live the relative freedom that we've got in this country. There's still more than 70 countries around the world where homosexuality is illegal, 11 countries in the world where it's capable of being sentenced to death. We've got a role on the global stage through our position in the Commonwealth, through our membership of a variety of pan-national organisations to do all that we can to champion those rights around the world.
I think that's right, and I thought that was very encouraging what the Minister had to say.
Yeah.
I shouldn't have gone last, should I? Everybody said the good answers on this one.
Everything they said.
Everything they said. So I'm sort of going to say a very now thing. It's not really a next 5 years thing. It's a next 5 months thing. Hopefully that's okay. Because I feel like we're at a really tricky crossroads culturally at the minute. I genuinely feel we are in the grip of a largely media-driven moral panic about trans people's existence and humanity. And you are also seeing that bleed through into the way that all LGBTQ plus people are being treated. And you're seeing kind of a return, picking up the point that I was making earlier about kind of the equalisation of the age of consent. I see and hear all the time LGBTQ plus people, including me, getting accused of being groomers, getting accused of being dangerous to children. And I think it's really easy to dismiss that and say, oh, that's just social media, it's not real world. And that's true. We know the vast majority of the British public are incredibly supportive of, indeed proud of, lesbian, gay, bi and trans people. We know it's not a majority opinion, but it doesn't mean that it's not a harmful set of opinions and quite a dangerous set of opinions. And kind of we started tonight with 2 minutes silence, I'll try not to cry, for our siblings in Oslo. You know, not Afghanistan, where it's illegal to be LGBTQ+. You know, in a country that is in many ways very similar to ours in terms of the kind of rights and protections that LGBTQ+ people enjoyed. And yet there is this awful queerphobic hate crime taking place. And I really think it is important that we, as a whole society, stand up and use our voice to say we don't want to live in a world where LGBTQ+ people are treated with suspicion, are treated as if we're a danger, because it is wrong and actually because it risks taking us back. So I've got a kind of next 5 months wish, which is about that really, and walking away from this way of thinking and talking that is just so harmful and so hateful.
And driving a wedge in our whole equalities movement, which shouldn't be there.
I agree. It
shouldn't be there. As my departed late colleague Jo Cox says, we have a lot more that we agree about than divides us. And it worries me terribly. It worries me terribly.
And we've spoken a lot tonight about discrimination, whether that be in the workplace or whether that's in the form of bullying and in schools. So I was wondering what could be done about homophobic bullying in schools, because I think a lot of people would argue that in school is kind of where prejudice starts. So is there anything that can be done to eradicate that and just make schools a safer place to be, so that the next generation of LGBTQ+ people just have a more positive time than a lot of us probably did in school?
I think, coming on the back of the Awareness Week last week in respect of bullying, as someone who was bullied for a small amount of time whilst I was at school, I think the whole discussion and debate about bullying has come on absolutely leaps and bounds, and I think schools are much, much more aware of it than they ever were. And it's an issue that sometimes comes up in my constituency surgery with parents coming to me with concerns about their child who may be trans, who may be gay, who may be non-binary, and their treatment at school. And I think it's a fact, I think that we can all acknowledge this, that kids can be cruel, can't they? You know, we've all been to school, we've all seen what can happen in schools. But I think the more people come forward, the more that's challenging those schools about their policies and practices with regards to how they treat it is a way forward. And there are some great examples of some schools doing some really great work on this, and I can point to some of them in my constituency. And I think academisation doesn't actually help get that message across. I know from being in a constituency where virtually every school is academised, and so none of them are under the control of the local authority, that getting a unified message out to all those schools is quite difficult. And so I think more work needs to come from the Department for Education in respect of that, in terms of getting that message to every school, wherever they are in the country, whatever size of academy or trust they are in. But I don't think it's as bleak as you said, that kids have been cruel, and we know that they can be. But I think there's some really positives out there that we can build upon.
It's better than it was, for sure. I mean, just to kind of pick up, the point I made earlier, I think, is really relevant here, which is we need to support teachers. We need to train teachers so they're comfortable talking about LGBTQ+ lives, families, experiences, because there's no way you can have a competent anti-bullying policy if teachers aren't comfortable. You know, it's the opposite of don't say gay, right? If you're not comfortable saying gay, you're not going to be able to deal with homophobic bullying in your classroom. And there are a lot of teachers that are scared, particularly, I think, in primary school. So I'll speak as a mum for a minute. I remember that the first time I watched children realise that my children had two mums, because they tend to just assume that we're the same person, even though we don't really look alike. They're like they all look the same. It's what primary school children think about lesbians, it turns out. Anyway, but the first time I watched that happen, and I was on a school trip, and my son Nathaniel was maybe 6, and the little girl, who shall remain nameless, said, you know, but who's that other person? That's Nathaniel's other mum, right? And bless her, she went, ooh, that's gross. At which point the teachers froze. They froze. They didn't know what to do with it. They were like, can I challenge this? How do I talk about it? And I said, no, it's not gross. It's just, that's what our family's like.
It's our family.
That's what our family, and you know, it was fine. And we had a conversation, and the teachers were terrified that I was going to kind of like, I don't know, begin like striding up and down, giving a lecture or this kind of thing. But actually just talking to an adult who just said, well, some families have got two mums, and that's what our family's like. And then we went back to talking about a recent holiday, and it was fine. And I think there's something about really supporting those teachers. I think Peter's point is really well made about schools being able to communicate and learn from each other being a big part of this. And then just picking up on DFE, and specifically on the experience of trans children. What exists in Scotland that doesn't exist currently in England or in Wales or in Northern Ireland is good quality guidance about how to include trans children in schools. So schools don't have something in all of those other countries like they have in Scotland that tells them this is what good looks like, this is what the law tells you, this is what good practice tells you. And so individual schools are trying to figure it out. They're quite often being threatened with litigation for trying to include trans children. And it is a real gap. And again, how are teachers supposed to do a good job of looking after a trans kid in their school when they don't know whether they're allowed to say things, they don't know what they're supposed to say? So I think Peter's right to say we've come a long way, but there are definitely some tools that we can give teachers and schools at every level that will make them much more able to provide a safe environment.
The DFE could be clearer about this, in my view. And indeed, the Ofsted could make that good be part of the way they judge a school.
Yeah.
Well, thank you all for your time. We've had some really insightful answers, but that unfortunately is all we have time for today. I would like to thank our great panellists for their contributions this evening. And thank you to everyone who made it here today and everyone at home for joining us. There will be complimentary drinks after we finish, so do hang around if you're able to. But yeah, thank you again, everyone.